Hi.
Good to be with you.
Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to welcome Edwin Cameron, the Honorable Edwin Cameron, to Daily Cloud. Welcome, Chancellor Cameron. I'm going to call you Edwin with your okay. Welcome.
Definitely, and I'm delighted to be with you, Naomi.
Fantastic. So we have a global audience. So the Honorable Edwin Cameron is a kind of byword for heroism in many countries that are familiar with his work. But those of you who don't yet know about his work, he's really considered a hero in many movements, including the movement for racial equality in South Africa and the movement for LGBTQ rights worldwide. He was Justice of the Constitutional Court of South Africa. He was Judge of the Supreme Court of Appeal, many judgeships. And he was also Chancellor of Stellenbosch University, and now he is active with prison reform and prison safety. And he's been called one of South Africa's new heroes by Nelson Mandela. So right now he is inspecting judge of correctional services, as well as Chancellor of Stellenbosch University. Is that so many accolades I can't even put them in one narrative, but that's essentially what you're doing right now. Is that correct?
Exactly, Naomi.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I am especially eager and excited to talk to Edwin because he and I connected around an issue that's very much in the news, which has to do with some would call it a scandal, others wouldn't, and I guess that's what's newsworthy about it. The head of Magdalen College at Oxford University, Dinah Rose, is acting legally against the right to equality in marriage in the Cayman Islands. Can you tell us more about that, Edwin, please?
Certainly, Naomi. The Cayman Islands government is what I would call, I think fairly call, a homophobic government which denies its LGBTIQ citizens equal rights. The particular legal fight here is the right to marriage equality. Now, the Cayman Islands are only about 300 kilometers from Jamaica, which is one of the worst homophobic places in the world, where queer people are brutalized, murdered, beaten up. And the point of mentioning that is that the whole of the Caribbean has got an LGBTIQ equality backlog, a huge deficit. So you might think, well, the question of marriage equality in the Cayman Islands, what's the big deal? It is a big deal. It's a big deal for queer people throughout the Caribbean. And of course, I'm an African. I'm a white African living in South Africa. It's a big deal in my continent as well, because most states in Africa still criminalize same-sex conduct between consenting adults in private. Just 15 months ago, two men who specially booked a room in a lodge in Zambia were peeped upon by the lodge staff, who called others, and they saw what they were doing inside their own room, two adult men, and those two men were sentenced to 14 years imprisonment. So this is a real issue. It's a real issue in Africa. It's a real issue in the Caribbean. It's a real issue in the Middle East and North Africa and the Islamic world. And the particular issue that you and I met on again, I think I should tell our listeners that we first met at Rhodes House in Oxford, because we were together speakers at a weekend that the warden of Rhodes House had convened, and we sat next to each other, and that conversation was very memorable indeed to me, and I thank you for it. So we both, as Oxford alumni, have an interest in what people at Oxford are doing. And a very distinguished QC called Dinah Rose. She had a thriving practice. She liked to bill herself as a human rights lawyer, and she was known in that capacity. She took the case on behalf of the Cayman Islands to deny LGBTIQ people the right to marry. That's the blunt end of it, and it's almost the end of it.
Wow.
And yeah, she has been acting. What happened is that there's a young couple, two women of color who want to get married, Ms. Bush and Ms. Bodden-Day. And they went to court to say that they had an entitlement under the Cayman's constitution to get married. The Chief Justice of the Caymans, Chief Justice Smelly, upheld their right. And Ms. Rose intervened professionally, and she's been acting professionally, and this is a point that she relies on, that we'll explain to our viewers and listeners later. She took the case professionally. She reversed the Chief Justice's judgment in the Court of Appeal. The Court of Appeal ruled that they had no right to marry in the Caymans. And now this young couple have taken the appeal to the final Court of Appeal for the Cayman Islands, which is a former British colony, which is the Privy Council. Now, one thing that I have to explain, Naomi, is that the Privy Council usually sits in London, but it's not a British court. It does not apply British law. It is applying Cayman's law. And the 5 judges who heard this appeal last month happened to sit in London, but the Privy Council has also sat in Mauritius, it's also sat in the Caribbean, and for example, it hears death penalty cases. The death penalty has not been on the statute books in the United Kingdom since about 1964, when the Labour government of Harold Wilson abolished it. So to say that the Privy Council is a foreign court seems self-evident, but many self-evident things in this whole saga have become distorted, have become, I think, in my honest opinion, manipulated and displaced. So the Privy Council has heard the appeal. We don't know what the outcome is going to be. And I can explain the legal issue. The legal issue is an interesting one to a lawyer, which is that the Cayman's constitution was amended to add in a section, section 14, to say that the right is protected for a man and a woman to enter into a marriage. Now the question for a lawyer is, does the protection of the right of opposite-sex couples to marry imply that same-sex couples cannot assert a right to dignity, to equality, to marry as well? That's what Chief Justice Smelly said. He said, yes, you've got the right to marry. It doesn't matter that the right is protected specifically, enumerated as a particular right for opposite-sex couples. You've also got rights to dignity and to equality.
Gotcha. So I just want to, this is fascinating and very distressing at the same time. I just want to restate what I think is at the center of this case. The 2 young ladies who wanted to marry are protected. They're arguing under laws that guarantee equality, right? Like the Equality Act in America. Everyone has equal rights under Cayman Islands law. However, because marriage is described as between a man and a woman in another section or another law, these are in conflict potentially, and the Privy Council has to decide which of these is going to prevail. Is that correct?
I will give it a gloss, Naomi, if I may.
Please.
Section 14 doesn't say marriage is only between a man and a woman.
Right.
It says that the government, the state has a duty to protect the right of men and women to marry across opposite sexes.
Right.
So this would be easy to understand for many of your viewers and listeners who are in the United States. When Edie Windsor brought her case to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court in 2015 ruled famously and wondrously that there was a right to marry for same-sex couples. There was no provision in the United States Constitution that said they had that right. The justices, Justice Kennedy specifically, based the right on the right of equal protection. And that's what these two women from the Cayman Islands are saying. We don't mind that you are specially protecting the right of men and women to marry opposite-sex marriages. We are saying that we also have a right, like Edie Windsor did, and we are asking you to do what Justice Kennedy did in the Windsor case, which is to protect us. It's actually the Obergefell case, by the way, Naomi. Edie Windsor's case was the previous case, but she was leading up to Obergefell, which was decided in June 2015.
Thank you so much. So this is really eye-opening to a lot of people, including me, because I think many of us just assume that it takes proactive legislative action, like a law, to ensure, what colloquially would be called gay marriage or LGBTQ marriage or marriage equality. But it seems like you're explaining that it doesn't take a law, that it can be quite a benighted country in a lot of ways. My country, your country, the young lady's country, in other ways, but that it takes a judge's decision to apply equal rights law to everybody when someone says, I too have the right to marry. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. And they are relying on the right to equality. And I think very importantly, because this is where we're going to get to in our discussion now, the right to dignity.
Right.
So let us accept, and this has been the one thing that has been said, this is an interesting and important question of constitutional law.
Right.
Perhaps from a conceptual lawyer's point of view, certainly it's an intriguing question whether the specific protection of one category of marriage thereby implicitly excludes allowance for same-sex marriages. So the Cayman Islands government was certainly entitled to litigate that. Right. They were certainly entitled to hire lawyers. But who did they hire? Yeah. They hired Ms. Dinah Rose, who was a QC at the London Bar.
And a QC is Queen's Counsel, which means what exactly?
It means you're at the top of the tree in the barrister's profession. 100 QCs, Queen's Counsel in the UK, amongst many, many more ordinary barristers. So you've achieved a level of professional recognition and distinction, which is rare.
Gotcha.
Now, so Ms. Rose argues the matter in the Court of Appeal and she wins. She then applies to one of the English-speaking world's best-known educational institutions, which is Magdalen College, Oxford. Of all the Oxford and Cambridge colleges, there are about a handful, maybe Christchurch, St. John's College in Cambridge, a few others. But Magdalen is right up there. It's one of the best-known academic institutions in the world. Magdalen College has an equality policy. It says that you have to nurture and protect the equality and the dignity of LGBTIQ students. Ms. Rose wins the job. She becomes president of Magdalen College, and she doesn't give up her brief to defend the Cayman Islands, to professionally defend, and this is her point, the Cayman Islands homophobic law precluding gay marriage. So
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry, Edwin, please.
No, you want to say something, and I know what you want to say, and I want you to say it, because I want to embellish it.
Well, it's such a thorny situation, right? I guess I'm astonished really that the Magdalen trustees or board that hired her would not have seen this as a conflict of interest and requested that she recuse herself from that case, or else not take on the responsibility of nurturing and protecting, you know, I think several hundred young people, which would include the mandate to create an atmosphere of equality and inclusion for young people of all sexuality.
And don't forget,
yeah,
no, don't forget that value that we mentioned earlier, dignity.
right.
By telling me that I'm not allowed to marry equally with the rest of the world, you are injuring my dignity. You're telling me I'm of lesser worth. You're telling me my autonomy is worth less.
No, absolutely.
So,
I mean, just to jump in and contextualize, I think it's easy for a lot of people who are not members of the LGBTQ community to dismiss the centrality of the right to marry as, like, you know, gilding on the lily, frosting on the cake. You know, it's a nice to have, not a need to have, from the perspective of a lot of people who don't understand the essential human rights aspect of the right to marry. But if you look back at other ways in which marriage was excluded, for instance, in Nazi law, as a Jew, I couldn't marry or stay married to an Aryan, or, you know, I'm especially horrified that the Caribbean has such homophobic laws because of the laws against quote unquote miscegenation, or laws, you know, until the 1950s or early 60s in the American South against white and black couples marrying. There is a very ugly history of denying the right to marry to people who are considered less than. And there's a reason that those fights were so heartfelt and necessary for the equal rights of everybody. Sorry, Edwin, go ahead.
no, I want you to take my own country. I grew up in apartheid South Africa. The prohibition on mixed marriages, as they were called, was enacted with extreme precision and viciousness in 1950, the Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act. So I grew up, my whole adult life, there was this prohibition that a white person could not marry anyone who was not a white person.
Wow.
It was a demeaning prohibition. And it would seem evident that if you took a professional obligation to defend the prohibition, you might be performing a professional role. But if you've got another role, and let's come back to what you said just now, conflict of interest. If you've got another role where you owe a duty to people injured by that prohibition, how do you sort this out? Now, what happened here?
Yes. So jumping in, Dinah Rose has been in the news since about December of last year, at least, for this, what I would say is a clear conflict of interest. And you issued a powerful statement that Daily Clout published. We were honored to publish it, explaining why it was so serious and asking her not to represent inequality in the Cayman Islands. And since you and I last spoke and published your fantastically important statement, the Junior Common Room at Magdalen, JCR, for those who don't know what that is, that's the students basically, and kind of the student government, also issued a statement. Their conclusion is somewhat different from yours. They concluded that everyone has the right to legal counsel, so she should not have to give up representation. That's how I read their statement. However, they affirmed how hurtful her representation was to the members of Magdalen College student body who were LGBTQIA, and generally they opposed the discriminatory nature of what they saw as the homophobic outcome of her act. So do you want to speak to kind of what you want to have happen, and any response to the fact that the JCR concluded somewhat differently than you did about what should happen?
Let me go back a few steps, if I may, Naomi.
Please.
You raised the question of what the Magdalen Fellows, which are you call them trustees, who control the college, who are the fiduciaries of its members, its students, and of its multiple sources of wealth. We don't know. And there's in fact a freedom of information request at the moment. It'll be very interesting to know exactly what Ms. Rose said. We do know that she said, I've got 2 pending cases. I've got one case in Hong Kong and I've got one case concerning the Cayman Islands. Did she say to the Magdalen trustees, the case I'm doing in the Cayman Islands is in order to deny LGBTIQ people the right to equality? We don't know.
But
So
I mean,
until we know, let's leave that to one side.
I'm so sorry, Edwin. Say that again, please. I just spoke over you.
We don't know. I'm simply saying that until we do know, until it emerges, what explicit disclosure Ms. Rose made during the appointment process, let's not comment on that.
Okay.
If she didn't say, I want you to know that this case involves me in my professional capacity as a QC, as a practitioner at the bar, defending a homophobic marriage bar. If she didn't say that, there may be consequences. Let's leave that to one side.
Gotcha.
The second thing that you said, Naomi, that's of great importance is the statement by the Magdalen undergraduates. The JCR are the undergraduates. Now, I have a law clerk who was also, she was not from Magdalen, but she was an undergraduate at Oxford. She said, isn't this a no-brainer that the president of the college defends professionally homophobic marriage ban? What's there to argue about? Well, that is why we're having this podcast, because there is such a deep divide on this. Ms. Rose has said, I have professional obligations. There's a cab rank rule. The cab rank rule says that when you come to me with a brief, unless I have very good reasons not to take it, I've got to take it. Well, 4 former chairmen of the bar, 3 former chairpersons of the bar in England and Wales, plus the head of the Bar Standards Board, a former Bar Standards Board, have said, they pointed out what we've known all along, which is that the cab rank rule does not apply to foreign work. Ms. Rose's defenders say, oh, but the Privy Council sits in London. Well, it doesn't always sit in London, and it doesn't apply English law. So there are all those, I regard all of that as kicking up dust. Whether the cab rank rule applied or not, I think the cab rank rule is very important. I instance the case of Adolf Eichmann. Did Adolf Eichmann deserve to be defended?
Yeah.
Yes, he did.
Yes.
You go to a lawyer and you say, do you want to defend one of the world's most notorious mass murderers? And they say, no, I don't want to. And I say, I'm briefing you, you've got to. Your duty as a lawyer is to defend even unpopular causes. It does not apply to foreign governments which defend homophobic rules in the Privy Council because it's a foreign court.
I understand. So let me ask, so you're answering one of my questions, which is also at the heart of this tangle is, and this is what the JCR surfaced, everyone's right to, legal representation. So you're saying, which seems right to me, that even though I think you agree that everyone has the right to legal representation, there's no reason, it seems, she shouldn't have recused herself at the point that she accepted responsibility for the emotional well-being of all these young people under her care and nurture. Is that the basic point, that you're not saying?
You put it beautifully. Okay. You put it beautifully, Naomi. As the head of an Oxford college, as the head of one of the Anglophone world's premier academic institution, you have a particular responsibility of equality. If this was defending South Africa's miscegenation laws in the 1980s in the Privy Council, if this were defending the Nazi laws against people like you marrying Aryans, we would regard it, as my law clerk said, as a no-brainer. Yeah. Why are we arguing about it? And I want to answer that question seriously. Please. The English academic establishment has remained silent, including people who wrote to me personally, including gay heads of academic institutions, who said to me, I'm horrified, but I can't say anything.
Why?
Senior lawyer, well, that's what I want to come to. Senior lawyers who spoke out when a QC in London, Mr. David Perry, was briefed to prosecute Hong Kong protesters. People spoke out and said, this is an iniquitous brief, you should not accept it. It's not an exact analogy, but there are comparisons, right. Valuable comparisons. Right. They all spoke out. Why did they not speak out about Ms. Dinah Rose taking on professionally the defense of the homophobic exclusion
I don't
against
understand it.
same-sex marriage?
If she had
Well, I
the
think
ability to, why would people not be saying, look, in your private life, you can make any decision you want, but you are now head of college. You have certain responsibilities in writing. I mean, I've looked at the mandate for, the model and head of college, and it includes things like making sure it's an emotionally safe environment. I'm paraphrasing. But it directly goes to being responsible for creating an atmosphere of equality in that college. So why are people not speaking out? Why does it take you and me to have this conversation? You in South Africa and me in Massachusetts or New York State.
Naomi, I think you've put your finger on the underlying problem, which is that there's still a deep default homophobia. What are you queers making such a noise about? You've made enormous progress. You've got equality, marriage equality in 20 to 25 countries in the world. It'll come. Keep quiet, pipe down, be patient. The reason why there is not an outcry, there would be an outcry if the Cayman Islands government said, no more Muslims. We don't want Muslims.
Right.
No more Jews. Naomi
Right.
Wolf, you
Right.
can't visit. We don't want Muslim and Jewish tourists. If Dinah Rose had sought to defend that professionally in the Privy Council while being president of Magdalen, there would have been universal outrage. The only inference we can make is that queer rights, LGBTIQ equality, our right to dignity, our right to autonomy, our right to security, somehow in many people's minds matter less. And of course...
Yeah. No, I hear you. I guess when you first started this discussion, you shared with me something that, even though I'm deeply immersed in this subject, I did not know, which was that in the Caribbean and in parts of Africa, there are still these kinds of like 19th century level brutal laws and punishment against same-sex contact between men, I assume, in particular. And I knew that this was true in Egypt and in Lebanon and in some parts of the Muslim world, but I did not know that, Jamaica, for instance, did you mention Jamaica, is still so homophobic. So these are like not theoretical issues. This is not just symbolic. This is propping up and supporting a regime that is surrounded by regimes that still brutalize, men and possibly women too. I don't know the law for same-sex contact. So it's very appropriate to compare it to apartheid law. It's very appropriate to compare it to, laws against miscegenation and sorry, that's my dog. We'll have to cut that. Say that again. It's very appropriate to cut the two. It's very appropriate to compare that to laws against, Jews and Aryans or white and black people in South Africa. And I am shocked, and I don't understand, knowing a little bit about optics at the university level, even if the Magdalen fellows, who are also academics at Magdalen, right? Even if they thought it was not a big deal, why would that conversation not take place quietly? Look, Dinah, this isn't worth it. Just recuse yourself. It's generating bad press. Donors are unhappy. This could turn into, a scandal, even if it hasn't yet. Why isn't, I don't get it. There's so much, as we would say, political capital being burned up in this ugly representation, whether or not she thinks it's the right thing. Why hasn't quiet pressure behind the scenes led her to step aside and just say, you know what, I believe in my client's right to representation, but it's not the right time and place for me to do this.
And it's not right for me to do it as head of a major academic institution where I owe duties of nurturance and respect and care to LGBTIQ students.
Exactly. So why, I know you said it could just be homophobia. These are not considered important issues, but nonetheless, it is generating negative press. Why do you think, do you have any inside knowledge about why she's holding on to this, or why the Magdalen Fellows aren't being more forthright?
Can I make something clear? I'm not accusing Ms. Rose personally of being homophobic.
Sure.
And I never have. I've been very careful not to.
And
my point is that professionally she took a homophobic brief. And the point that you and I discussed earlier is that deep default homophobia in English society means that there hasn't been an equivalent outcry about that. But let me answer your question directly, Naomi. I think Ms. Rose thought, and in this I think she's been going to be proved catastrophically wrong. I think she thought that she could do a quick, short, sharp spring campaign and win the war. And she's won some early spring campaign victories. The legal establishment is closed behind her. The academic establishment has remained silent. But there's a long way to go. And this issue is not going to go away. My friend Gilbert Marcus, whose mother escaped from Czechoslovakia when many of his family perished in the Holocaust, he wrote a piece on an Oxford website recently in which he said this issue is going to continue to haunt Ms. Rose. And that is what remains. It will continue to haunt her because of the fundamental wrongness of what has happened. And through all the rhetoric and the dust kicking up about bar rules, the obfuscations and the diversions, the complicated arguments that people don't always understand about professional etiquette and professional obligation, behind all that, the only question is, did she owe a duty that should have led her to give up this brief? And that, to that thing, as my law clerk said, the answer is a no-brainer.
Well, those are powerful words to conclude on. I just want to chime in as a former student, both as a former graduate student in my mid-20s at Oxford, then as a returning student in my 50s, and now as a mom. These are not trivial. This question you just asked is not trivial. And people, I think, are brushing aside the trauma to young people at a formative stage in their life when the person who is tasked with being really in loco parentis, or like creating an atmosphere of equality and safety and dignity, demonstrates a commitment to a client who is trying to suppress the dignity and rights of other young people. And educationally, this is damaging. My hero, as you know, John Addington Symonds, in 1859, when he was a teenager at Balliol, he then was a graduate student at Magdalen, and the Magdalen Fellows dragged him in for private correspondence that had homoerotic content, and that was a trauma that stayed with him his whole life. It's another, it's the 21st century, and we're still not creating a safe environment for LGBTQIA students at Magdalen College. This isn't trivial. When I was a student in the 80s, there were professors who were sexually harassing their female students, knowing that they were protected and that there weren't clear boundaries around that kind of behavior at the administrative level, deeply affected my ability to feel safe as a young woman student, and deeply affected my educational freedom and autonomy, because part of your mind is always preoccupied with, am I safe? Does this mean that this is not my home? This is not my university. They don't want people like me. And so we're doing that by tolerating this kind of abdication of her role as an educator of protecting the safety and emotional development of LGBTQIA students at Magdalen. I think she's inflicting, and Oxford's inflicting, similar harms on young people there today. I just wanted to say that as a mother and as a former, student at Oxford. I think I'm just agreeing with you, but, chiming in. It's not trivial. These are not symbolic harms. You've been so generous. So what should people do if they agree with you? What should people connected to Oxford do if they want to support you? What are next steps that we should tell people about in case they want to take this further?
I think organizationally, organizations who are concerned about Oxford's equality and its dignity for LGBTI people should write to the Vice-Chancellor. The Vice-Chancellor, in the peculiar structure of Oxford, doesn't have direct say over Ms. Rose, but they can write to Magdalen College, to the Fellows of Magdalen, and say what they think. They can write to Ms. Rose personally at Magdalen and write courteously and with propriety and indicate that they think that there was an intolerable conflict here between her duties of nurturance and respect and dignity towards the LGBTIQ students and her professional prosecution of the homophobic brief. So there's a lot that can be done, but if we go back a few steps, Naomi, I want to close off on the fact that I want to use the word continuum because it's an important thing. I said in my statement to Ms. Rose that these actions, including the defense of the homophobic ban on same-sex marriage, contribute to a continuum of hatred and stigma and ultimately of violence. And I think there's a continuum across the whole world. For so long as LGBTIQ people are unequal in Africa, in the Caribbean, in the Caymans, we will feel it. People will be attacked in Africa, attacked, harassed, assaulted, arrested, thrown into jail, injured, beaten up, and often murdered. And that's the continuum I'm speaking about. I'm not saying that this is a direct act of violence against anyone. I'm saying that there's a continuum of hatred, of prejudice, of stigma, and that ultimately harms.
Absolutely. And just to add to that, I think Oxford, as you pointed out at the start of our talk, has a particular moral obligation as such an influential institution. If there were a powerful gesture of repudiation of that, role of representing such a hateful client and action, it would, I think, protect people around the world as well, or help to create an environment of equality that would protect people. Chancellor Cameron, you've been so generous with your time. Thank you for explaining this incredibly important issue in ways that everyone can understand and take action on. I'm going to take action, and I encourage everyone, whether or not they're connected to the university, to write to the fellows of Magdalen College and say what they think now that you've heard Edwin Cameron's incredibly important elucidation. And thank you for being a hero. I just want to say that. Thank you. We need our heroes.
Thank you, Naomi. Such a pleasure to talk to you.
Take care. Bye-bye.